Hello everyone, today we talk about communities of prayer in the Carolingian era, right? Literally a blossoming of them, especially in Charlemagne's and Louis the Pious times, not surprisingly, because this was a time essentially of great revival, properly of ecclesiastical reform. It's the moment in which properly also the Carolingian humanism, enlightenment, if you want, by some excess, took place. Right, this need of homogenization of cultural practices for the sake of, sponsoring the unity of the empire, right? And prayer played a great importance in this because it was still perceived. Here we're just basically 300 years after the fall of the Roman Empire, not very far, especially in Central Europe, from that, pagan contractualistic background. Prayers were mostly seen as a sort of, still in the ancient Roman sense of the munus of the thing, right? As a contractual negotiation, fundamentally, with the divinity. If I pray, you give me something back. It's dot des, fundamentally. It was, however, functional to an important series of things that had to do mostly also with the money involved for such, for carrying out such prayers, and all a series of internal development, also properly of ecclesiastical institutions that we'll try to look at. So we could start from Ratger's times at the Abbey of Fulda in the Eastern Frankish Kingdom, where fundamentally, we'll skip properly his times, but they were addressed as under these abbots as moments of decline of prayer practice. Albeit under Ratger the monastery actually had an important development, etc. But at this point, the monks, we were talking about the beginning of the 9th century, etc., demanded a restoration of the liturgical practice that was customary before Ratger's times. Right, this had to do in practice with substantial obligations like prayer for the rulers, his children, the entire Christian people, the populus Christianus. Right, and it was properly scheduled in a very rigid way, right? There was a prayer for all living benefactors each Monday, a commemoration of all the deceased brothers twice a day, right? For the same vigil of 50 psalms each month, an annual vigil and a psalter for Abbot Sturm that had been one of had been founded fundamentally of the Fulda monastery. He was a follower and disciple of Saint Boniface on their anniversary, etc. And in addition, they requested that priests could be given the opportunity to celebrate Mass more often at the same time, as it had been done previously to Ratger's time, and also that the major saints' days had to be again honored, right, with traditional masses and vigils. So it's pretty clear that at the beginning of the 8th century, liturgical activity increased. Right, and this naturally goes in parallel with the broader development of monastic institutions since Benedictine times. We're talking about very different realities. The time of Saint Benedict, especially in his early preaching, in places like Italy, etc. There was a completely different world, right, with a few monastic institutions, also not of. That were very much urban in nature, so the Saint Benedict went founding them into the wilderness. In early 9th century Francia, the situation was completely different. It was a structured church of Gallo-Roman origins that the Frankish had sponsored and strengthened in its organization, and that was very rich. Right, so we're talking about monasteries as great landowners and capable of investing a lot of resources in these liturgical activities. Naturally costed a lot because of the votes, the activity itself. Sometimes, as we will see now, that the rhythm was exhausting. Right, we have a supplex libellus reflecting this reality, where priests, especially, and this is an important note, properly as the clergy, had a great importance. Right, we will see how the lay monk fundamentally was rarely here part of the picture. In Fulda there were lots of priests, as well as in other some of the most important abbeys of the broad Carolingian world. There were, counting the subdiacons as well, 70% of the monks of the abbacy of Rabban were of clerical rank. This is impressive. Of those monks who were still in minor orders, many were destined to be ordained when they were old enough, right? There was all an eater, as we'll see, especially an early ecclesiastical education was usually preferred. The lay monastic community of late antiquity thus had become fundamentally one of monks in holy orders by the 9th century. These belonged to communities of prayers and were properly clergy, and not just autonomous, adventurers like at the time of Saint Benedict. So their numbers kept increasing, right? The clergy was ever provided with ever more privileges and power and land by the Carolingians, because they expected fundamentally of it to grow as a sort of parastatal entity that wouldn't go dispersed like in the lay assets. Albeit this clergy came naturally, especially the most important ones, hierarchically from the same nobiliar families, so they share the same culture, but in practice they couldn't inherit, at least namely the abbeys, etc., and the offices, and therefore this was seen as an opportunity for central power to administrate the various ecclesiastical assets, right, more, or at least to influence them more directly with ad hoc appointments and things like that. The rise of communities of prayer specifically is witnessed properly also by an architectural point of view, as in the case of the plan of the monastery of St. Gall, that mentions 19 altars in the main church alone, which means that all these altars corresponded to various communities of prayer, that they were, in a sense, separated and still coexisting within the same monastery. So pretty crowded as well, and this meant that these altars were also needed at similar, at the same time. So there are various reasons why this happened, right? As we have seen, that this fits properly in a broader ecclesiastical development, but not only, right? The insistence on prayer is fascinating. Missionary and pastoral activity of monks here played a part, especially from the British Isles, that, as you know, were in Carolingian times, also before this one, were playing an important, very important role in the evangelization of continental peoples, especially the ones of new Carolingian conquest were still pagan. But there is properly a bias towards the prayer and the mass in particular, which was here bringing both religious and by religious and laity alike. Right? Why? As we were saying in the beginning of the video, it was widely believed at the time that a mass was a sort of gift to God, right? That usually to express, of course, gratitude in general, to beg for assistance, or to placate impending wrath, right? A glance at Carolingian sacramentaries that mainly came from monasteries shows immediately what the purpose of masses actually was, right? And it's quite material, if you want. Things like warding off bad weather or safeguarding a traveler. Naturally, there was a broader, spirit in the sense of, mostly for war, like, may God make our armies victorious, things like that in a military society that surely such as the Carolingian fundamentally was. But still, there was this idea that whenever something bad happened, it's because, you hadn't prayed enough, right? And this, as we were saying before, came from properly a central ritual in the church that had become a gift, a munus, right? From which a remuneratio, that is, the counter gift, a reward, fundamentally, was to be expected. So more masses, more more results for the empire, for the chosen people of the Franks, as they considered themselves, right? And these masses costed. as we were saying before. And there were, for this reason especially, not the regular masses like the communal one, the missa publica, the public mass, but special masses, the missae speciales, that in this reason did contribute importantly to distract the attention from the public ones as well, which reflects, in my opinion, also this aristocratic bias, if you want, that we were saying before, also about the whole background, because maybe these people were not aristocrats all themselves, but they surely shared this, they were under aristocrats. These were all fundamentally broader clienteles of nobility that had founded these monasteries, that had patronized them. Sometimes they were the same king's ones, as we'll see. Royal abbeys here had properly an institutional role, also properly for prayer, to provide such protection through prayer. In any case, customization of devotional practices that surely pushed for this kind of personal interest also of the monasteries to carry out these masses and so on. The laity too, as we've seen, had actually invested a lot in such masses because they properly believed in the capacity, in patronizing these churches and so on. It was an instrument of political control as well as actual belief, right? The penitential practice, as you know, was something that also the Irish and Anglo-Saxon missionaries had brought to the continent in a reinforced way, right? Especially introducing private penance was very harsh, right? And having masses or psalters sung had been transposed as a way to fundamentally fulfilling this penitential obligations. Why? Because they were monetized, right? There was specifically a set of conversion tables drawn up to calculate the exact relation between alms and prayers, right? So that you could essentially monetize them all. And this tells also, on the base of the fact that they were counted in solidi, so an important currency, how expensive they were, how much money actually gravitated around these activities. For example, 2 masses or 100 psalms was 1 solidus. 10 solidi could substitute for 6 masses or 6 psalters. 20 solidi represented 12 masses or 12 psalters, right? Amalarius of Metz shows brilliantly what this whole thing meant. Quote, all these sacrifices have been offered by the priest as well as by the people, so that the Almighty God will not count our sins. Right, so literally, right, you understand it from a theological point of view. We know in Christian terms this is nonsense, right? The Bible says clearly enough that basically the more God loves you, the worse is going to happen to you in your life, right? So these people were still from a pagan background. They still, essentially, we know it, right? The same needs of ecclesiastical reformation, but still this mentality is still to be found in France in the 13th century, in the higher nobility. Normal people didn't study theology deeply or understood, but it was believed that this as a superstition, but also functionally so. Like, we don't have to think that this was something negative to court because, we are the smart, rational, modern people. We suck. We're disgusting individuals. These people did it for a broader balance and order that was not merely a psychological thing, a superstition. It was properly, as we have seen, a way to patronize and to sponsor important clienterly connections. But still, the meaning, the power of these masses was seen in this regard, right? That fundamentally, for all the saints that were committed, if you paid enough, fundamentally you could be forgiven. Monks and canons were the ones that would carry out this enormous amount of prayers and masses, psalters, masses, etc. Right, and monks and canons were very important clergy because, unlike the ordinary village priests, they were selected properly in their lifestyle to devote themselves to these duties. Why? Because they lived in ascetic communities. Right, they were considered as sort of purified individuals with some, reliable standard of, in order to mediate between God and mankind, right? This was the purpose specifically. So there was an important, in this, say, atmosphere of reform, there was this sense that whoever had received the, quote, terrible sacraments in a state of impurity could not perform an effective sacrifice, right? And that God would have punished them with illness or even death, right? So this is at least what moral miracle stories said, right? So much that usually child oblates had usually an advantage over the adult conversi because they were considered, let's say, more habituated to ecclesiastical life and to have been literate from an earlier age. So this was a very good prerequisite for priesthood because also literacy was considered still in these early, still archaic, early medieval world as a sort of magic. If you want, these were literally magic formulas that were conceived as such in a broader sense, and they properly they embodied ritual purity, right? Demanded to the ritual purity demanded through mediators. Alcuin wrote about Willibrord, one of, as you know, insular missionaries, quote, "He was taken to Ripon right after having been weaned and grew up there seeing and hearing nothing but good and saintly things." So naturally there was this broader sense of, being exposed literally to a magic atmosphere and these ideas that were in themselves sanctified. Naturally, even in this attempt of generalized reform, the standards of such organization was, and the way psalters, masses were performed, community of prayers operated, were different, were heterogeneous, right? There were also, women could not say mass at the time, but for example, they participated in all other duties, such as singing the psalms and other prayers pertaining to the office. In the Liber Memorialis of Remiremont, the names of founders, abbesses, kings, and the dead sisters were recorded for commemoration. This is typical of the time, these books of properly of life, of memorial books, with the names, right, that these masses were made for. Praying for one's own dead in world society was one of the most important things, right? They literally believed that by doing so, the soul, for example, lighting up more candles, literally the soul of the dead would rise to the heavens more quickly, right? It was properly seen. There was this very, if you want, as we were saying before, contractualistic, materialistic almost approach to such things. You understand that the major monasteries, the founders and abbots and abbesses were considered as the top figures for which most of these celebrations should be carried out. In Fulda specifically, the cult of the dead seems to have gained particular momentum at this time. There were the Annals of the Dead here kept from 779 AD onwards, to be continued up to the 11th century. So a very long tradition. Also, the commemoration of the living, though, was very important, because this was part of that, active, for way of patronizing, or sponsoring, etc. And in especially towards the great political authorities, was a way to essentially get a remuneration from them, right? Even they would spend resources in their name. We're talking about also the sovereigns, not only, because the broader net existed also within the laity, and the same thing about the bishops, the abbots themselves. In the second half of the 8th century, these so-called confraternities of prayer began developing further along this pattern. At first, they were restricted actually to the elite themselves. That is, this was a way for abbots and bishops to mobilize their own communities for prayer, specifically. The most famous of these reunions was the agreement Conventum of the Synod of Attigny in 762. So the bishop and abbots present there promised properly the amount of psalters and masses that would be, respectively sung and read in 100 each, and that in the event of death specifically. So this was standardized properly for every time somebody of these individuals died. Also, 30 masses were said to be said by participants personally, right? So they took also personal commitment for, putting themselves on the fore and celebrating. So it's a huge duty, right? It costed. We're talking about hundreds of these things. So literally think about in terms of labor, of hours, and things like that. So until well into the 9th century, the confraternities of prayer were predominantly an internal affair for religious communities proper, right? Only rulers as laymen could participate. The others fundamentally were excluded. So this reflects the political bond between the emperors and the church, right? We have memorial books of Carolingian age, known as the Libri Memoriales, also called Libri Vitae, properly books of life, that still exist. And these are beautiful because literally there are the names of all the people these masses were said for. For example, the most important one is the Confraternity book of Reichenau. This probably began in around 884 AD, and it basically brought into the book 50 in the names of the the dead and living brothers and sisters of 50 monasteries. Right, so whoever organized it had surely a lot to do in this regard. And the names are so important to us because they show us something that normally is unknown, that is, who were the people who lived at the time. Here we have all the names, all properly the kind of the different social statuses that we can desume from them, also from the same order of these names we can understand so much, right? And the picture that we get from this is that it was a huge network of prayer spanning the Carolingian Empire, because historiographically speaking, it was believed that it was rather the Anglo-Saxon missionaries to have been the creative force behind liturgical commemoration, right? This, however, doesn't seem to be the case, right? The Carolingian system already by itself, and for the fact that the same Anglo-Saxon missionaries could operate in their territories, shows that there was a degree of development that was already, the base for that to happen, right? This was altogether essentially a late antique legacy, right, as a form of also ecclesiastical, essentially of support, of community support in a way. And importantly enough, these networks consolidate properly in parallel with the consolidation of the same Carolingian Empire, right? The monarchs founded on prayer their powers much as on military might, right? It's like the tripartite orders. Peasants worked, the priests prayed, and we could say the military men fought in this regard. It was technically all functional to it, right? Because the same peasantry was framed in this idea that they were working for, having somebody that had, only in a teleological sense, right? It is all aimed at the for providing all the spiritual and material force to these mounted elite the Carolingians have created as becoming knighthood in practice, and this is a very overlooked aspect actually of the same knightly history, because properly, these people had to be indoctrinated. They had properly to believe in the fact. They had to be perfect Christians, at least, for the standards, as we've seen, that they were required in order to be effective fighters. They had to be properly fed morally, right? So the whole society at their back was supporting them, and prayers were a dramatic, scenographic, in the dimension of this effort, and it's greatly overlooked, especially by modernistic interpretations. Naturally, the eminence of monarchs, of dynasts, is reflected in the books of life themselves, because they were the first persons to which especially special prayers were devoted to, right? It was the most important individuals in the kingdom. It's on their base that fundamentally the system also held in a more kind of an orderly direction. Throughout the 9th century, Carolingian power fell apart essentially by itself, right? And it was the same kings that actually boosted prayer in specific moments for quite material reasons. And there you understand that aside, you always have to hear that they believed in this, right? But the practical effect is overlooked too, because by praying all together in front of a catastrophe, for example, there would be a greater sense of, okay, we will make it all together as a community, right? This won't give us, the chance to for somebody to rebel, because simply things went wrong and there is less power from a local level, a central level, and therefore somebody can take over it. There was a specific interest in this regard. Somewhat late in 874, so it's definitely not a particularly bright moment for the imperial unity. The Annals of Fulda record the disastrous cold that happened in that year's winter that killed many humans and animals. Well, at this point, King Louis the German agreed with anxiously with his counselors on, quote, the Concordia et Statu Regni. Properly, this gives the sense of the concord state of the realm in its unity, right? And devoted himself to prayer during Lent. A king, right? Then one night he had a vision, allegedly, this is all a story, of course, but of his dead father, Louis the Pious, who addressed him in Latin, by the way, so pretty mediated instead. Well, not much, because Louis the Pious actually was an enlightened sovereign, a bit like Charlemagne. He understood. He was the most, the one that, in fact, as you understand, also from the surname, the nickname, got the most of the ecclesiastical ideology, and in a moment actually was quite difficult in his own reign as well. From the hereafter to tell him how much he was tormented and how badly he needed the assistance of prayer to gain eternal life to him, right? So this brought the shocked Louis to the German to send out, at least this was the ideal reason, right, to letters to all monasteries of the realm, in a moment had been dramatic, requesting to intervene with God for his father's soul, right? And at the end of the day, this bad winter was interpreted as a punishment sent by God for the failure to pray for the dead emperor. So this was a way to, as you understand, to boost fundamentally a unitary political ideology, right? A legitimization, in this case a dynastic one, in a difficult moment, because really such freeze could create lots of problems for the forage of the next year, campaigns for protecting the country, all these things. So it is not so new problems on the horizon, right? So this is so immediately understandable. There is also a spirit of penance, together with one of prayer, at the heart of monastic identity, as you know. There were some, in Fulda after the troubles of Radger, the crisis of 812, brought to a broader scandal, if you want, of a need of reformation, of purification, etc. So this brought to the councils of Aachen that took place between 816 and 817. This is where they decided to properly safeguard and restore the liturgical duties, right? So the main object is for prayer to have been unisonos, right? To have been carried out in a way that, you know, the whole empire would produce itself in front of God in its unity, right? In its order, in its uniformity. This is exactly what the Carolingians at this point were pushing for, right, in ecclesiastical policy. The claustrum in itself, the cloister as the monastery, was conceived as a barrier, properly as a perimeter. It was the monastery was meant to be the faithful reproduction of heavenly Jerusalem on earth, right? And from there to spread by example. But the claustrum had to be closed properly to preserve the purity of the monastic community, and in its role here, the inner world of prayer specifically. So the ousting of Radger in 817 had followed for Fulda, and the restoration of let's call it the old order, were closely connected to these Aachen reforms, right? Fulda was the center properly of this, the mover, if you want, the original, just one of this broader need for reconstruction. So there are also, many hints, many informations from the names of the reform-minded abbots that we find in the first layout or Reichenau's Confraternity book that show how much the link with reformed ideas, the revival of communitary prayer actually was, right? They stemmed objectively from the same root. And these centers are quite important. Here we're naming Fulda, Reichenau, we've seen St. Gall, etc. The Eastern Frankish Kingdom played a very important role in this, because in many ways, there are certain dynamics that wanted these centers to be closer also to authority and not much prey of the local lay ambitions. We say that these are the same centers from which a unitary ideology was also being born concerning properly a Teutonic identity, because the Eastern Frankish Kingdom was a patch of peoples that really didn't have much in common. Here, the German who was pioneered from these ideology makers that are specifically the monasteries of Reichenau, St. Gallen, that came up with the idea of unity. I never think this is anecdotal, because the Eastern Frankish Kingdom was particularly troubled, and this need of unity was boosted, was advocated for dramatically. There are also some more personal, interesting, events, like how did these people properly leave the prayer? Like what they did did they think it was worth for them? There is a voice of Vetti of Reichenau. It was a monk that would die shortly afterwards in 884. So he knew he was about to die, fundamentally, and he was wondering, we have the writing says, he was wondering whether he had failed somewhat in his duties, right? Remember the munus that we just said, so duty and reward at the same time. He said, have I not done sufficient penance, right? And for this reason, he actually wrote himself to 10 brothers of his in particular, to commemorate him with 100 psalms and 100 masses, right? For, I presume, when he would have died. So that there was a fear here behind the fact of, have I not prayed enough? Have I sinned excessively? Have I, done something wrong for which I have not deserved to be saved, right? that problem was, resolvable in part with prayer, which, if you think about it, is a very materialistic view, of the value of the soul and of human action, right? Naturally, as we said, this was clothed with an idea of sanctity, of magic, that, for which these people were the purest of the world, of the known world, in this perception. They would fundamentally consider that extra gear that would allow to make the magic done, right? So it would have not been just everybody praying for. In this regard, the connection was very close also with sovereigns, as we've seen so much that certain abbeys were attributed properly the title of royal, right? Because their monks were chosen in order to pray specifically for rulers. Monks, nuns, they were all provided with the task of intercession in this regard. And in the whole Carolingian era, monasteries became, therefore, specialized in prayer, reflecting this broader harmony that the Carolingians had built, especially under Charlemagne, Louis the Pious, of the, let's say, of having the spiritual, the sacerdotal class, creating an harmony between God and his chosen people, the Franks, through this mean. Alright, so, well, for today we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.